Jim McMahon.
Here.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I just say how moving I thought the closing of that debate was, in particular your contribution, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'd like to start by thanking you and the Opposition Chief Whip for granting me permission to bring forward this important debate to the House of Commons chamber today. As those in the House will be aware, it's rare for a front bench spokesperson to take to the back benches and to lead an adjournment debate. It reflects the issue of safeguarding and child sexual exploitation in Oldham, and allowing this debate to be had highlights just how important that is. This debate builds on the joint statement issued by myself, the Honourable Member, my friend, the Member for Oldham East and Saddleworth, and the Right Honourable Member for Ashton-under-Lyne. I want to set out how I intend to use the time we have today. Firstly, to focus on victims and the findings of the report. Secondly, to focus on the safeguarding challenges during the period covered by the review. And finally, to touch on the disinformation campaign surrounding it. Mr. Deputy Speaker, child sexual exploitation is a painful reality that all sides of this House recognise. It's in every community and we must fight it together. The National Independent Inquiry into Sexual Abuse, chaired by Professor Alexis Jay, was published in February this year. Its stark conclusions demonstrate that children are sexually exploited by organised networks in all parts of the country in the most degrading and destructive ways. Last week, the Independent Assurance Review into historic child sexual exploitation in Oldham was published, and it's important that the House has the opportunity to debate it. I would like to place on record my thanks to those who led the independent review team, notably Malcolm Newson, who I'm sure the Minister will know from his work in the Home Office, and former Senior Police Officer Gary Ridgway. On release of the report, Mr. Newson said, "We found that throughout this period, especially services tackling child sexual exploitation provided by Oldham Council and Greater Manchester Police was strategically ahead of those available to many local authorities at the time. However, these did not always translate at an operational level into the effective safeguarding of children experiencing sexual exploitation." He went on to say, "Our own review of a sample of children has exposed significant failings provided by the statutory authorities to those children. We understand that Oldham Council and Greater Manchester Police have agreed to reduce the management of those cases to consider whether any further action can now be taken in respect of the men who exploited those children." In that context, it was right for Greater Manchester Police and for the Council to accept the findings in full and to give a full and unqualified apology to those who were let down. In response, Council Leader Amanda Chatterton told the press conference on the day, "The vast majority of those children received the support they needed and they were kept safe." The report references some of the commendable work of our social workers in children's homes, but what is clear is that that wasn't true for all children, and one child let down is one child too many. It's absolutely imperative that our residents have confidence in those people that work to protect our children. The report included the case of Sophie, whose abuse began in 2006 when she was just 12 years old. There were a further 10 sample cases which were later referred to the Messenger Project, but which were not adequately followed up by Greater Manchester Police or by social services. The Council has confirmed that during the course of the review period, 11,000 safeguarding referrals were made to the authority, and that the vast majority would have received appropriate support and safeguarding. But let us be absolutely clear. It is of no comfort to survivors who did not get that support.
Can I intervene on my friend?
Of course, I'll give way to my neighbour from Oldham.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and I know that he feels grief as I do in terms of what too many of our young people have been through. But I wanted to commend, as I think he will as well, the victims are coming forward, the courage that they've shown in retelling their story and the pain that must have had, these horrific crimes against them, we also must condemn. But is he as concerned as I am, for example, that there have been failings in our institutions, Oldham Council and Greater Manchester Police and certain individuals? And would he want, as I do, to be reassured that if there has been any negligence in their roles in protecting these vulnerable children, then they should go through a disciplinary process. And could I also, and apologies, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for being a little bit long in this, but could I also ask him whether he has confidence in what's being proposed under Operation Sherwood, that it will deliver what it is meant to do in enabling victims to come forward and ensure that offenders are also receive the full force of the law in making sure that they have the punishment for the crimes they've committed.
Thank you. They're very powerful points. It's quite clear that victims have been let down, and when they went to the people that were there to protect them, social workers and police officers, that they were left standing alone. And even with the passage of time, we need to make sure that the perpetrators who carried out those disgraceful acts of abuse over a long period of time feel the full weight of the law. But frankly, as leaders, we put our trust and confidence in the professionals in the police service and social workers to do the right thing and to always step up to make sure that nobody falls through the gap. And if there is any evidence that any professional reviewing those cases did not take the action that we would all demand and expect, then that absolutely has to be reviewed and revisited, whether they are currently in post or whether they have left post. I would also say this: if there is any evidence that people have got that hasn't yet been provided to the authorities, where there are criminal allegations or evidence of failure, then they need to be brought forward to the appropriate authorities so that they can be properly investigated and seen through. So I absolutely agree with all those points. And I know that members across the House have dedicated themselves to supporting survivors of abuse in overcoming the hurdles in accessing justice. As MPs, we do it on a regular basis. And in the cases outlined, the courage shown by victims who came forward absolutely stands out. The report can be broadly separated into two areas of focus: on the operational response to keep young people safe, and on political leadership, and allegations online being levelled over the last 3 years that abuse by organised gangs was being covered up for political gain. It's important, therefore, that we do not shy away from the organised disinformation campaign that sought to undermine the report and the independence of the report from the outset, now going so far as to claim that the investigators themselves are part of an elaborate cover-up. The report does not hold back from highlighting poor practice where it was found. They told uncomfortable truths in Manchester, in Oldham, and they will do the same in the next stage as the review moves on to Rochdale. Can I ask the Minister to join me and others, such as the Mayor of Greater Manchester, in condemning the abuse that the authors have received, and to underline the importance of the integrity and the independent nature of the report? Mr. Deputy Speaker, for my part, the independent report is clear that during the period from 2011, when I became the leader of Oldham Council, I did absolutely everything possible to publish the threat of child sexual exploitation, and I'll pull out the quote used by the report, that I sought to tackle the issue head on. This was a hard and drawn-out battle to improve safeguarding support, and that battle continues today. Setting out that journey, I think, is important. In the year before Labour gained control of the council, children's safeguarding had been hit by a budget cut of £720,000, including £100,000 from the specialist CSE messenger programme and a £100,000 cut from the CSE residential care home, removing dedicated police security that was in place to protect highly vulnerable girls from the abusers who sought continued access. Recruitment and retention of social workers was under significant pressure, with almost half of all posts covered by agency staff, with a high turnover of vacancies. And the long-promised IT system was late in implementing, and demand for the service was increasing year on year. The change in administration took place 2 months after the Rochdale grooming gang was charged, with Shabir Ahmed as its ringleader, an Oldham resident and former council employee. Oldham immediately put safeguarding at the top of the priority for the council and for the police. His association with the council was reported in national newspapers during the case as it progressed through trial. The council believed strongly, and it was reflected in the actions of the council, that it had to use all that was available and take whatever action was needed to tackle CSE and to learn from the experiences elsewhere to raise public awareness. Where concerns were raised about the risk associated with the growing number of shisha bars, the council did all it could to close them down and ultimately succeeded, publicly sharing concerns about high-risk venues, both in the Manchester Evening News and an in-depth feature on BBC Radio 5 Live. Crucially, this also involved giving professionals in schools, in colleges and others working with children updated guidance through the Phoenix Practitioner's Handbook of CSE, and that identified shisha bars as high-risk venues. The report highlights that the disruption activity was ahead of its time. And when the report into abuse in Rotherham was public, Oldham Council carried out a full review of taxi licensing. While the increasingly robust response was challenged, including by appeals that were successful in the Magistrates' Court, in the end we had the toughest regime in the region, addressing head-on licences that were issued to people that we believed posed a risk to the public. And although the report concludes there was no widespread grooming in taxis or shisha bars, it demonstrates that Oldham's concerns were legitimate, and although progress was made, at times, frankly, it was frustrating. But the determination to reduce the risk of harm was absolutely clear. Oldham never shied away from either the scale or the complexity of CSE, or for that matter, forced marriage, FGM, online harms, radicalisation and extremism. The risks were fast-moving, evolving all the time, and they still are today. By 2014, all social workers were employed by the council, except a single member of staff who was covering maternity leave on agency contracts. The new IT system had been brought in, ending gaps in records on complex cases. Oldham was one of the first in the country to establish a multi-agency safeguarding hub and to grant access to the Police National Computer to boost intelligence sharing. Oldham had developed a public campaign, including holding educational plays in schools, that resulted in 70 victims and witnesses coming forward to tell their stories. It held stalls in the market hall, and article after article set out the full scale and the nature of abuse taking place in the community, often in plain sight. The council also actively debated CSE in full council and was open about the scale, the nature and the risks it presented in Oldham. And by 2014, the Phoenix programme was rolled out across Greater Manchester with ongoing campaigns under the It's Not OK banner, supported by dedicated local charities, including COGS, which stands for Keeping Our Girls Safe. This is important because ultimately, creating the space for victims to come forward is vital to securing justice. Ofsted inspections, peer reviews, internal reviews all pointed to Oldham leading the way in CSE, and that was reflected in feedback from the Home Office too. That the report now points to significant gaps in support has been met with dismay and, quite frankly, frustration. And I am deeply sorry to all those young people that were let down by the services that should have been there to protect them. The report shows that there is much political leadership can achieve, but it also lays bare its limitations too. The political environment then and today is important, and while I'm supportive of the review and believe strongly it needed to take place, my deep frustration is that the continued undermining of the independence of the report diverts focus away from justice for CSE victims and dangers eroding confidence even further. My town has seen it before, with far-right protests taken to the street, smearing whole communities and setting out to divide. And it's increased significantly with the rise of social media and conspiracy theorist platforms such as Reclusant 9, led by Raja Mia, who seeks to make financial and political gain by spreading hate, racism and disinformation. We need to be clear with the people of Oldham about the motivations that sit behind this, and it has little to do with being a victim's champion. Mr Deputy Speaker, why am I being so direct in this debate? Because as Chief Executive of the Collective Spirit Free School, he presided over a catalogue of serious safeguarding incidents, ranging from violence against pupils to child abuse in school. Not only this, but unbelievably, he responded to a catalogue of abuse at the Collective Spirit Free School and referred to it as all lies, dismissing the experience of the victims that were abused. One of the most serious cases was confirmed by a serious case review conducted by the Manchester Safeguarding Partnership, where failings at the school prolonged the sexual abuse of a victim. And add to that, allegations that teachers were sexualising children and basic measures like background checks were not being carried out. And worse, if it could get worse, that the safeguarding register was falsified during an inspection to cover up the failings that were taking place at the school. To preside over this is one thing, but to deny it, those are not the actions of somebody who puts victims first. I'm proud that as a Member of Parliament, I stood up to give a voice to pupils, to parents and to staff to expose the corruption that took place and eventually to see the closure of those schools that were a risk to our children. And it is this, Mr Deputy Speaker, that sparked the current campaign of targeted abuse, harassment and division in Oldham as he set out on a self-declared campaign of revenge. It's no accident that his campaign began within a week of being named by the Department for Education investigation.
And will my honourable friend allow?
Of course, I'll give way.
My honourable friend is making such a powerful speech, and I pay tribute to him really for the strength and determination to call out what has been quite disgraceful behaviour, Mr Deputy Speaker. The malicious statements that have been made by this person and the disinformation, the misinformation that has been spread has contributed to division and hatred in our town, of which we have both received. And it is not just something that is happening or is confined to Oldham. And I think this is an important message I would like to put to the Minister, and I welcome her response. If this is not tackled, this will spread beyond Oldham. This type of these malicious statements that have taken hold, and it must be tackled.
I agree, and after 3 years of this cloud hanging over our town, I can say the damage that it caused, both to individuals who have been targeted by abuse, but also to families. Yeah. To have your home targeted, to have death threats being levelled, and all that brings the anxiety, the stress and the strain. And it's very difficult to even talk about that in a conversation like this when we're reflecting on such a damning report where victims have been through far, far worse and they need to be our focus.
Yeah.
But the context is important, and it is important that it's called out, because I can see and I can feel that my town of Oldham isn't just being divided, it's hurting. And it was evident at the special meeting of the council that took place on Monday. It's true to say that some who are central to this campaign are driven by hatred, politics, and some do have links to the far right. It's also true that some have been central to spreading lies and smears and constant harassment to those that they oppose. But we also need to be clear that not everybody who shows concern, who expresses disagreement, who attended that meeting and who make references online are any of that. There are many people with legitimate concerns, and it's important that we address those concerns head on. It was clear from that meeting there are victims who have been let down, and when they came for support, they were turned away. It's clear that others have loved ones who have been victims, and there are others who are just horrified at the reality of abuse that takes place in our country. But if we don't build trust and a common ground in the mainstream of politics, the conditions for such a sensitive issue to be used to divide a town, I'm afraid, are set. Hope Not Hate, journalists and others have exposed this. But without action, we face the real risk of returning to the ashes of a town divided. And more, that the disinformation and hatred being set out is destroying the confidence that allows victims to come forward to seek justice through the proper channels. And so the question is, for those of us who are genuinely determined to move forward and to repair the hurt in our town and for the victims, what are we going to do differently to create an environment where people can come together and work towards fighting against the evil of child abuse together? The Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, said, "Public confidence comes from a willingness to be unflinching in facing up to these claims and to be honest about the past, however difficult that might be. And it also comes from a readiness to bring perpetrators to justice regardless of the passage of time." And I can say to the people of Oldham that your MPs will fully play our part. My friend, the Right Honourable Member for Ashland-Lyne, said this: "As Operation Sherwood commits to reopening investigations, we will be pushing for action. And in the end, that will be the only test to deliver justice for victims both identified in the report and beyond the report. There must be a readiness to reopen cases and to secure convictions." I hope the Home Office will provide their full support in that mission, both in Oldham and across the country, and that they will encourage victims as we are to come forward, knowing that they will get the support that they deserve. And I'll leave my final word to the Greater Manchester Police Chief Constable Stephen Watson, who said, "My message to those offenders is a simple one. If you think you've got away with it, you're wrong, and we're coming for you."
Minister.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I think we can all agree that we've heard an incredibly powerful speech and a very thoughtful one from the Honourable Member for Oldham West and Royton about an extremely difficult subject. And I have no doubt that victims of these absolutely abhorrent and atrocious events will commend him and his honourable friend for Oldham East and Saddleworth for setting out their very, very strong commitment to securing justice for those victims, which is what we all want to see. And in that, he will have the full support of this side of the House and the full force of the Home Office and the Home Secretary and every single minister in the Home Office. And I do, before I move on to sort of give my actual formal response, I want to say that I join him wholeheartedly in condemning what he's alluded to. I have no personal knowledge of the types of issues that he's referenced, so I cannot give a substantive response. But I can say from my position as a Home Office Minister that to call into question the integrity of those law enforcement professionals who dedicate their lives and careers to investigating these incredibly disgusting and abhorrent crimes I think is frankly outrageous. It's completely wrong, and if anybody thinks that there is any question about their professionalism, they need to take a good, long, hard look at themselves. It is absolutely wrong. So I will give way.
I apologise. This may seem a little bit trite after the support that she's given, but there were failings. We need to recognise this at an operational level, both in the council and in Greater Manchester Police. And it, you know, as majority of police officers, the majority of council workers will be doing their best. But there were failings from some individuals, and that needs to be acknowledged. And these children suffered as a result.
If you'll forgive me, I'm going to come on to say exactly that, and I hope she's not conflating the 2 points that I'm seeking to make, which is absolutely there were failings by professionals that were supposed to be safeguarding vulnerable children, which they have both set out. What I'm talking about is the work of the reporting bodies, the ICSA report led by Professor Alexis Jay, and the other reports that have been taking place, and absolutely they have the knowledge of what has gone on in an incredible level of detail, and they have set that out. Children in Oldham were failed, as is shockingly demonstrating in this report time and time again, by those who should have protected them. As they both said, the vast majority of safeguarding professionals, law enforcement, are really good people doing a very difficult job. As in any walk of life, there are bad people, and where they exist, we should do absolutely everything we can and call it out. Those failures are shameful. The report that they've alluded to, it has made 6 recommendations, and we will publish the government response shortly. I was absolutely appalled when reading the experiences endured by children, not yet teenagers, in Oldham, and it's in no small part due to the ongoing tenacity of those children, now adult victims and survivors, that those awful failures have been uncovered. And if I could just make a personal comment, I really do find this the absolute worst part of my job, having to read those reports and reading the stories, some of which is not in the public domain, but I can't sleep at night when I've read those. So I'm sure all members will want to join me in paying tribute to those victims, survivors and their families who have courageously shared their experiences in the pursuit of change. And what happened in Oldham has happened in too many places right across the UK. But there have been significant changes in how local authorities and the police safeguard children. I want to agree with the members opposite that victims should come forward and report abuse wherever it's taking place, because they can have confidence in the police and other frontline services which will take them seriously. So the best tribute we can make is to ensure that others don't have to endure the same ordeal. And so I will set out quickly, in the time I've got left, what are we doing? We are supporting the police to make improvements. Home Office investment underpins strengthened law enforcement capability to tackle these crimes. We welcome the work of Operation Sherwood to bring those prosecutions against those sexual abusers of children. We're funding specialist training called the Vulnerability Knowledge and Practice Programme, which identifies best practice and shares this with all forces, and I want to thank the College of Policing for what they're doing there. And to be clear also that political and cultural sensitivities should never hinder these investigations or the delivery of justice for these victims. We have made it very clear to the police that protecting vulnerable children must be a priority, and to this end the Home Secretary has shown real leadership here. She has raised this through the primary forum that exists to her, which is the National Policing Board. We are ensuring that performance is rigorously scrutinised, and she has commissioned Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services to investigate how police across England and Wales handle group-based child sexual exploitation. And I think it's right to say that we have been on the front foot here, because unlike the historical inquiries, this will give an up-to-date picture of the quality and effectiveness of how forces are supporting victims and bringing offenders to justice now. And so we expect findings from the inspection by the end of this year, and I trust it will give us some much-needed assurance that the policing of these crimes has improved, but make no mistake, should deficiencies be uncovered, we will do whatever it takes to address them. And our approach, as they both know, is underpinned by the Tackling Child Sexual Abuse strategy, which was published in January last year. And of course, ICSA will publish its final report. They've touched on this report. That will be published very shortly. And of course, we will come forward with a full response to that. And again, we will set out our actions. And more widely, our Beating Crime Plan reaffirms our strong commitment to ensuring that more of these complex crimes end in prosecutions and convictions. And we have relaunched our Victims and Survivors of Child Sexual Abuse Fund to support voluntary sector organisations in delivering a range of vital services. I just want to finish, Mr Deputy Speaker, by thanking the members opposite, and I'm determined to ensure that we confront these crimes wherever and whenever they occur and leave no stone unturned in our mission to keep children safe.
Is that this House do now, Jonas, may I say aye? Aye. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.